einen Vortrag zu präsentieren. Er hat sich schon in der Panel-Diskussion warm gesprochen und ist jetzt richtig in Fahrt und hat Verbindung mit dem Publikum aufgenommen, dass er Ihre Argumente schon antizipieren und gleich vorweg darauf eingehen kann. Herr General, darf ich Sie ersuchen um Ihren Vortrag?
Thank you. So, once again, good evening, and once again, thank you for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, General. I'm not going to talk much about strategy now. I hope that doesn't disappoint you. But I will talk about things that affect strategy. And my presentation is directly linked to General Neretnik's brief earlier today about the threats in the Nordic, but why we focus more on the Baltic Sea. We are indeed, the slide please. I can start speaking. We are indeed living in a very interesting time. During the first years after the Cold War and the fall of the wall, the development in Europe, particularly in the northern parts, seemed to be going quite in the right direction. But during the last years, we have realized that this was an illusion. One European country has been has invaded parts of a neighboring territory and is still waging war in that country. The Baltic region, and close to the Baltic region, Russia is acting in a provocative way and are high the tension in the area. And we'll come back to that later on. So, yeah. So the slides will come in a few seconds or a few minutes. I think I can continue without them. Yes, I will talk about the following agenda. I will just start a little bit with the Northern Europe, and then the Nordic-Baltic region as such, the Baltic Sea region from a Swedish perspective. That is really my perspective, so it's not an official Swedish perspective, but as a Swede, I have that perspective. Russia's behavior just now, other actors in the area that influence the strategy and the strategic situation, and then I will make some sort of a conclusion. I will, of course, focus on the northern area, but in order to understand what is driving the development in the northern Europe, you also have to understand that there are a lot of things going on in and close to Europe, things affecting the Baltic Sea region. For example, Brexit, as it is now, and its impact on the European Union is, of course, of great importance. Daesh attacks on the Western society with, for example, the terrorist attacks in Paris and in Brussels and other places, including Stockholm. Even if it was Daesh that did that, it was Daesh-driven. The actions in Syria and the refugee situation are important factors and to have in mind. And when you look upon the general security situation in Europe, it is important to see that we have the migration from Africa and from other countries coming even through Russia to Finland. The development in Turkey after the recent election and in Russia is also affecting the overall situation. So you all understand that I would like to stress the importance of approaching Northern Europe, even in the overall European theater of operations, in a holistic way. In an increasingly volatile security situation, the importance of Northern Europe has increased. From my perspective, the Baltic Sea region, of course, is of particular interest. This is not least because of the incentives created by, for example, the existing and planned energy infrastructure with the gas tubes leading through the Baltic Sea And you also have to be aware of, you heard earlier about the sea traffic to the northern countries, but I don't think everybody is aware that 50% of the Russian sea trade is passing through the region, and that is St. Petersburg harbor mainly. Kaliningrad is just a minor part of that. Then, of course, we have the historical influences in the area, with a lot of wars between all the countries, and especially not to mention that Denmark used to be the main enemy of Sweden, but that's forgotten now, I think. Even though my focus is on the Baltic Sea region, I do acknowledge the relations to greater Northern European region, including both the Barents region and the Western region, and including the Norwegian Sea, and also including what we heard yesterday, the Guyuk Gap. Together with the Baltic Sea region, these are all areas which have seen and are seeing increased military activity. Conflicts in one of these regions or areas would rapidly spill over on the other regions, and given that the potential opponents operates along the front line stretching from Southern Europe to the Barents region, ripples would be likely to spread beyond the confines of the Baltic Sea. I would now like to turn to how I am assessing the development affecting the Swedish security situation. The change that affects Sweden and the Sweden's armed forces the most is the security development in the Baltic Sea region. It is fundamentally driven by Russia's destabilizing behavior, both politically and militarily. Northern Europe is not the only area of friction, but next to the Black Sea region, it's the arena that Russia ascribes most importance. This means that our region is likely to be one of military positioning and posturing for the foreseeable future. My reading of Russia is based on the following assumptions. Russia will continue its effort to gradually enhance its military capability, even if it requires substantial economic sacrifice. We should remember that the investments that have already been made will pay off in the coming 10 years, even if the current reform is likely to slow down due to the general recession in Russia and through Western sanctions. Offensive use of military forces has become a central component in Russia's conduct. We see it in Crimea, in eastern Ukraine, and in Syria. Russia's strategic objectives include expanding its reach as a global power, ensuring it has a decisive voice on events close to Russian borders, and preventing the future eastward expansion of NATO. This also includes a clear geopolitical aim to challenge the European security order, divide European and weaken the unity of the European Union. Russia's strategy is increasingly focused on exploiting Western democratic systems' weaknesses. Non-linear warfare has thus become the preferred modus operandi of the Russian leadership. It aims to entertain a low-intensity conflict by operating unpredictably in grey zones. As a consequence of this development, the strategic importance of the Baltic Sea has increased and drawn more military activity to our vicinity. Access to territory, waters and airspace in and around the Baltic Sea constitute as a strategic advantage to all actors. We also observe increased foreign intelligence activities and information operations directed towards Sweden. This too is consistent with Russian doctrine, where the information arena is an important part of the battlefield. To some extent, this development also applies to the Arctic. The increasing importance of the Arctic area is generally due to two factors. Firstly, the climate change that opens up the area for the exploration of natural resources. Secondly, the Russian increased military presence in that area. Russia has made significant investments in research and extraction of gas deposits along its Arctic coast. Russia has also established a joint strategic command of the Northern Fleet. It is in our common interest that the Arctic remains a low-tension region. The good side of this is that fortunately the region is covered by cooperative policies practices, and fora that can nurture cooperation. To summarize my perspective concerning security in the Baltic Sea area, access to Swedish territory gives a strategic advantage for NATO as well as Russia. Conversely, there is a strategic interest to deny access for the opponent from both NATO and Russia. Sweden will inescapably be involved in the event of a conflict in the Baltic Sea area. Russia posturing increases alignment of interest between Sweden and NATO presence in the Baltic region benefits Swedish security. The activities in the Baltic Sea area has dramatically increased during the last years, both from NATO and from Russia. There are several purposes with this, such as training, show presence, show force, etc., etc. This goes for training, exercise at sea, in the air, and on land. Both NATO and Russia are training in larger formations and in more complex situations. We also see for the Baltic Sea area new or new yet old equipment and weapon system. I will walk you through a few of the activities occurring in the Baltic Sea area during the last years. I will start with March 29, 2013. I think that this, together with the invasion of Crimea, was some of the important triggers for the Swedish reformation of the armed forces. After midnight, March 29, 2013, Swedish radars detected 6 fast airplanes coming from the east, originating from the St. Petersburg area, overflying the Gulf of Finland. This was, so far, quite normal. However, this time they carried out a mock attack against Stockholm and an airbase in the south part of Sweden. On the slide you can see what really happened. We'll start with the figure 1. 2 backfire C escorted by 4 flankers leave the St. Petersburg area and fly out over the Baltic Sea in international airspace. This is quite normal behavior, and they do it often. But figure number 2, instead of using their normal route, which is the dotted line, you can see, southwest in the middle of the Baltic Sea, they turned right towards the Swedish territory. Close to Gotska Sanden, which you can see in the circle north of the island of Gotland, 35 kilometers from the Swedish border, they made a fake attack against Sweden. The targets are Stockholm and an airbase in the south part of Sweden. Number 4, the closest Swedish active airbase are Sotenäs and Ronneby in the south part, as you can see on number 4. But no fighter jets were on alert. But NATO, the figure 5, scrambles 2 Danish F-16A patrolling in Lithuania and shadows the Russians. And finally, the Russian aircraft returned to Russia the same way that I left. I can tell you that the fact that there were no Swedish planes on alert became a scandal in Sweden. And since that time, there are always planes in very, very high readiness, 24/7 all over the year. And I really doubt that that was the aim with that attack. The exercise Zapad 17 was a strategic joint military exercise of the armed forces of the Russian Federation and Belarus. The exercise took place between September 14 and September 20 last year. Approximately 30,000 troops took part in the exercise. I also want to mention on this occasion that on the last day of Zapad 17, the exercise Dragon, with more than 70,000 soldiers, started in Poland, and that was mainly land forces that trained in Poland. I will also just mention that Russia has deployed Iskander missile systems into Kaliningrad, and you can see that the range on the slide from 2 different types of the Iskander missile. To note is that Sweden's 4 largest cities are within that range. During this spring, Russia planned missiles tests in the Baltic Sea, in the economic zones of Sweden and Latvia, which is very rare. Those tests affected the civilian air traffic in the area. The exercise unnerved the West because of its scale, scope, and what NATO said, lack of transparency. At a time of high East-West tension, NATO officials worried that any accident involving military weapons and a civilian ship or plane could spark a wider conflict. To conclude, my, so to speak, military strategic assessment is that I do not assess any immediate threat of armed aggression towards Sweden or any of the countries in the Baltic Sea region. However, should the security situation deteriorate even more, an attack could occur swiftly. I have almost only been talking about Russia, but of course there's a lot of other actions that are affecting the tension in the area going on. You can read on this slide that Lithuania is building a fence. We have the NATO deployment into the Baltic states. As mentioned earlier today, the United States Marines deployment in Norway. They already have equipment for one brigade, as mentioned, in Trøndelag, in say, the middle of Norway. They also have troops on rotating bases, as mentioned, but now they will increase, and they are speaking, even it's not said, but they are speaking about up to one Marine brigade. You could also mention the Swedish exercise Aurora 17 last year, with 22,000 participants and foreign guests from the United States, from Finland, from France, and from all the Baltic states, and from Norway. Or why not the planned exercise Aurora 20, which will almost be almost like the Aurora 17. But as I said earlier, the high attention in the Baltic Sea area is fundamentally driven by Russia's destabilizing behavior, both politically and military. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to me. I will be glad to answer any question that you might have.
General, thank you very much for your lecture on the strategic situation focused from a Swedish side to the Baltic Nordic region. We are coming at this very long day, very interesting day, now to some questions. If there are some volunteers, please raise up your hands. Ja, bitte.
Not a question, but just a comment. In regard of Swedish defense industry and connections to the United States defense industry, even it is true that Sweden is not a member, Sweden is usually considered as one of the top electronic and top companies in regard of defense industry. So the United States is looking always to Sweden and to Switzerland. So both are neutral, or let's say not unaligned, but in regard of Sweden, because of your high-tech companies that you have, the connections between you and the US is totally different from the connections from other European states, even if they are NATO members.
May I just make an additional comment on that? And I fully agree that we have a lot of cooperation in the industry. And that is one reason. The other reason that is obvious and that are also well known is that we have quite good intelligence information that we trade with different countries, of course, and the United States is very interested in what's happening in Russia.
Sorry, you're even member in the NATO fusion set. Yeah, that's right.
Fine. Next question. Yes, please, General.
Now I know I will get a tricky one.
No, you won't get a question at all. It's just a comment. I would like to tell the audience that General Anderson was the exercise director of Aurora 17, exercising more than 20,000 people. That's quite unique in the in Sweden today.
Some more question? Yeah, please.
Johann Schmidt, German MOD. Thank you, General, for the presentation. What would be your worst case scenario for the Baltic Northern region, considering the fact that, for example, in the Baltic Sea, the Western forces are almost in all categories 5 times over the Russian ones and probably not lacking in quality? Second question, what would you think is the main reason for the Russian activities? Because if NATO needed any impulse to come closer together and to remember their original task, these maneuvers are an excellent inspiration to do that. And as you pointed out, it's an excellent inspiration also for your country, for Finland, many other countries, to build up their military. So why are they doing that? Because it should not be a surprise for Russia that this would be an indirect result. And the last question, do you think, would you consider the Russian behavior more offensive or more defense? Because if somebody plans an attack in the future, he would not alarm his potential enemy by doing such kind of maneuvers.
Thank you very much. To figure out the worst scenario is very tough, because there are scenarios that are quite severe. But if you mix a worst scenario but a likely scenario, then I would say accidental behavior, as mentioned, Russia is behaving very offensive. They are flying very close to our airplanes and dropping IR flares and things like that, very close, that could hit an airplane. They are flying without transponders in air-controlled areas. They were very close from the Danish perspective to collide with a civilian aircraft outside Copenhagen 2 years ago, I think it was. And such an accident could trigger skirmishes at least, and that is a very bad scenario. Even though I must say that during the last 2 months, during the exercise that we had at sea, they have been behaving much more not as offensive as usual. We're flying higher over the ships, and they have been that transponders has been on. So, but that has been during the last 2 months. But we have quite a lot of naval exercises. The second question about the Russian interest, I have it sometimes very hard to figure it out. As I mentioned in my speech, the reaction after the attack, the mock attack, was that from that day on we have aircrafts on alert 24/7, and I mean that shouldn't be an expected reaction. So I have it very hard to figure that out. I think that has to be more military, historic, educated persons than I to do that. But maybe they are just trying to keep us on the toes, because that exhausts you. I don't know. If Russians are offensive or defensive, their exercises are very offensive, what we can see. And they are sometimes acting offensive way. But, I mean, no country can, for example, blame another country for that they are deploying missiles on their own area, even if it's the Iskander missiles. I mean, that's all up to them. So you can, maybe it's defensive, maybe it's offensive. So that's very hard to tell. So you should not be too, let's say, you should not blame them too much for doing that, because sometimes offensive is a defensive tactic. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's the best I can do.
Accidental, provocative, or offensive? What would you say? I'm sorry to
Very provocative, I would say. Very provocative. Yes, yeah.
Some more questions, ladies and gentlemen.
I have exhausted you, I can see that.
Yes, last one.
During the Cold War, the Americans and the Soviet Union, of course, had the INCSI agreement to prevent mistakes, accidental operations actually afloat at sea. Do you see that a positive measure would be to try and revive that and indeed incorporate countries such as Sweden and others into such an agreement so that ships know how to behave? And
if you really could incorporate them in such an agreement, I mean, behavior at sea. But we have the, I mean, the laws of the sea are quite good, and I think they are enough. I mean, you know how to behave, even if some of them are not really regulations, but they tell you how you should behave as a gentleman, so to speak. So I don't think that it really would help. Maybe, but maybe not.
Fine. Thank you very much, General Anderson. We were starting this morning with a pointing out some comment on strategic leadership, and it was pointed out strategic leadership consists of character, experience, and competence. Thank you very much for giving us your competence and your experience. And to the audience, I may say, thank you very much for your input, and I can tell you your advice and input was very nice. Thank you. Now I may please now, Brigadier General, to summarize.
Danke, Herr General, für diesen wunderbaren, krönenden letzten Vortrag. Ich bin im Zuge meiner Ausarbeitungen ein bisschen unsicher geworden, ob das, was ich mir zusammenreime, nicht zu gewagt oder zu abwegig ist. Ihr Vortrag hat mich bestätigt, genau das russische Verhalten. Wenn Sie angreifen wollten, würden Sie es nicht so ostentativ zeigen. Das heißt, wenn jemand so provokativ agiert, dann spielt er mit genau der Möglichkeit, wie Sie sagen, er häuft Potenziale auf seinem Boden an, kann dafür keiner Rechtsverletzung geziehen werden, aber es genügt schon, Europa ins Gehen zu bringen. Das ist doch eine Strategie, die eigentlich, wenn sie auch gegen uns geht, brillant ist. Und ich denke, wenn wir so weit im strategischen Denken sind, hat diese Konferenz schon einen schönen Erfolg in der Bewusstseinsbildung gebracht. Es trennen uns nur wenige Minuten mehr vom Abendessen. Für Ihre Bereitschaft zur Diskussion, für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit, für Ihre Geduld danken und darf, damit wir morgen in der Früh besser starten können, sagen, wir beginnen wieder um 8 Uhr. Das Pendel Strategische Kultur, das Pendel Strategie und Medien, noch einmal zurück. Das Pendel 8 Uhr, Religion, Werte, Interkulturalität, geleitet von Brigadier Schuh, wird hier in der Sala Terrena beginnen. Das Pendel Strategische Kultur wird im Hörsaal 12 beginnen. Es wird an unseren Organisationstischen jemand sein, wenn Sie kurz vor 8 da sind, der Sie in den Hörsaal 12 hinaufbringt. Er ist im 1. Stock, aber es wird jemand da sein, der Sie dorthin führt. Ich danke für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Herr General, ich melde, wir haben den heutigen Tag beendet, darf die Damen und Herren zum Essen beglückwünschen und einen schönen Abend wünschen. Nach dem Essen treffen wir uns zum Kamingespräch, obwohl es keinen Kamin, aber ausreichend Bier gibt, oben im Offizierscasino, zu einem lockeren Gespräch, zum Austausch, zum Netzwerken, das wir als Ergebnissicherung der Konferenz brauchen. Dankeschön.